Okay.
Okay, so let's begin. Welcome to everybody, and I guess today as we come together again, it's a time for some celebration. I mean, we've had some victories. The XOT Energy's Husky Gas Plant and the Central Delivery Point plan for Eddy County is canceled. That was, yeah, that was to be 14 miles out of Loving. So, those of us in this area are grateful for that. And my information is that thing would have emitted 257 tons of nitrogen oxide, 226 tons of carbon monoxide, 742 tons of volatile compounds, and 182 tons of particulate daily. So that's a lot of stuff we don't have to breathe in. The XOT Cowboy Central Delivery Point has recently, I guess, started up and is hopefully a smaller fossil fuel footprint. So anyway, much credit to Wild Earth, the Guardians, and for their efforts in this regard, and I think also to XOT for really showing some concern for our environment and backing off of some of the stuff that they had planned. So we're grateful for that, and grateful for all of you who have really, I think, raised this issue to a new level. We've seen a lot of articles here in our local media that deal with this issue, and it's not just anymore that some of the community leaders are all in favor of it. So it's progress. So let's we want to welcome our CCFF members to the meeting, and the Permian Basin Coalition members and the New Mexico IPL members. Welcome to all of you. We've got presentations today from our folks who are with us and have really immersed themselves in this issue. So at this point, I think we'll, hopefully try to hold our presentations to around 10 minutes, and then if there are questions, we can pursue that. So I think we'll begin maybe with an overview of the scope of the oil and gas on the public lands, and begin with Kyle, if that's okay. So anyone want to add anything to the introductions here? If not, let's go ahead with Kyle and take it away.
So thank you, everyone. Allie is actually going to go first, I think, for us. We're going to split our time. And so Allie's going to do a bit of an introduction, and then I can do some follow-up after her.
Yeah, so there's a lot sort of in terms of the scope of both just sort of how much acreage it covers and things like that, and then also the effects of oil and gas development on public land. So I'm just going to give a sort of brief overview of, how much land are we looking at sort of across state and federal public lands in New Mexico that is sort of leased or used for oil and gas development and some of the consequences of that. And we have a sort of quick facts handout that has some more detailed statistics and information about some of those numbers, and then we'll also follow up with some additional information sort of according to what is of most interest to you all following from this around particular effects of that leasing and development on public lands, and around how you can participate in the NEPA processes, which Kyle will talk about in a moment. But just to give sort of a general overview of why the sort of public lands piece is so important when we're talking about oil and gas. And so just as an overview in general, when we say public lands, I'm referring to at the federal level, the lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And then at the state level, the lands managed by the New Mexico State Land Office. And so just in terms of the lands overseen federally by BLM, the New Mexico office that includes Kansas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma covers 45 million acres of federal mineral estate. And then specifically in the Permian, the offices, the sort of field offices of BLM of most interest, there's the Pecos District Office that covers the Permian overall, overseeing the Carlsbad and Roswell field offices. And that alone encompasses over 3.5 million acres of surface land, and then over 7 million acres of minerals, so oil and gas estate. And then the Carlsbad field office is especially relevant here, and NATO will talk a little bit more about that, as they'll be issuing a resource management plan for public comment and protest soon, in theory. And their planning area covers a little over 6 million acres and encompasses Lee, Eddy, and Chavez counties. And then the New Mexico State Land Office oversees over 9 million acres of surface lands and 13 million acres of mineral state over state trust lands in New Mexico. And then in terms of sort of how much of that land is leased for oil and gas currently, and Kyle will talk a little bit more about sort of the BLM lease sales in a moment, but basically BLM holds lease sales every 3 months for the federal public lands here to auction off these lands for oil and gas development, and these sales are held by particular field offices. So the Pecos District Office or Carlsbad Field Office. For example, there's a lease sale coming up in October with 11 parcels nominated, covering almost 8,000 acres. But overall, there's over 4 million acres leased for oil and gas in New Mexico by BLM. And so that's sort of overall time. And then just the number of leases themselves, there were nearly 8,000 just from BLM alone in effect in New Mexico in 2018. And so that's about a fifth of all BLM oil and gas leases across the US for that year, or in New Mexico. And then for the acreage, the over 4 million acres, that's an area that covers about the entire states of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. And that's about 17% of all acreage that BLM leased that year. And then for state lands, there's over 2 million acres of active oil and gas leases on state public lands in New Mexico. And Eddy and Lee counties of the Permian, it covers about 2/3 of those. Eddy and Lee County alone encompass over 1 million acres of state oil and gas lands. So for about 475,000 in Eddy County and about 860,000 in Lee County. And in terms of wells for all of these across public lands in New Mexico for both state and federal, we're looking at tens of thousands of wells. As of today on the OCD database, there were almost 42,000 active oil and gas wells on New Mexico's public lands. And that accounts for almost half of all the active oil and gas wells in the state. It's about 44%. And then in the sort of quick facts, they break down sort of active versus abandoned, temporarily abandoned versus sort of expired temporary abandonment wells by oil and gas and by state and federal management, but I'm not going to go into all those details here. And then just in terms of why this matters, in addition to it being encompassing just such a large area, and NATO will have some maps that show a little bit more about leasing in the Permian, and in the quick facts, there's also, along with that, a map that just sort of shows the overall picture of public lands and how concentrated both state and federal public lands are in the Permian and also kind of up in the northwest corner of New Mexico. But so as you all very well know firsthand, a lot of the sort of health effects that you're experiencing from oil and gas development now are only going to be exacerbated with continued development, and similar with climate on public lands overall. For BLM, federal public lands, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from federal public lands, this is using 2012 figures, so it's likely even more now, but it's equivalent to over 58 coal-fired power plants a year in greenhouse gas emissions, just from BLM public lands. Now that's across the US overall, but it's a huge contributor to climate change. And then just in New Mexico alone, according to the USGS in 2018, New Mexico is a source of 6% of all CO2 emissions from federal fossil fuel production. This is the second highest of all states. And just looking at the Permian, just looking at sort of 1 year worth of lease sales, just 3 lease sales from 2017 to 2018, BLM lease sales, if those were fully developed, BLM's own environmental documents that Kyle will talk a little more about, estimated that if those lease sales were fully developed, if all of the wells possible in those sales were fully developed, it would increase greenhouse gas emissions from federal public lands, mineral estate in the Permian by almost 50%. So huge implications there. And then of course the local impacts, and that's something that we will sort of follow up with you all when we talk about the public participation component of this, is how to voice your concerns about what you're seeing locally more. One sort of quick overview in general about some of the specific public health and safety risks related to spills on public lands here in New Mexico. There's more details on this in quick facts as well, but for federal and state combined lands, as of today, OCD has a database you can search. There were over 1,000 oil spills with about 85 in 2020 alone. And about almost 500 of those were classified as major. And then there were over, let's see, there are about 600, almost 600 natural gas spills, and about almost 75 of those in 2020 alone across state and federal public lands. And then a staggering over 1,800 produced water spills, and with over 150 of those in 2020 on federal public lands and 93 of those in 2020 on state public lands, and over 1,000 of those produced water spills were classified as major. So that's just sort of an overview of the scope of how much land we're talking about, and just some of the broad overview of emissions and health and safety risks that oil and gas development on public land poses.
Great, thanks, Allie. So I think I've worked or know a lot of you to the extent that we haven't worked together before. I want to tell you, I just want to start with Western Environmental Law Center first and foremost. We're a public interest environmental law firm, and what we do is represent other environmental nonprofit groups and sometimes individuals, largely at the nexus of, and this is in particular for our climate and energy program, we work at the nexus of public lands and fossil fuel exploitation. And so really where this comes into play, and I think in particular with you know, the greater Carlsbad landscape, is there's a big difference in New Mexico between the number of public lands that we have in New Mexico side of the Permian versus the Texas side of the Permian, which is largely predominated by private lands. And so what this does is it actually gives us some additional tools to work with pushing back against some of the failed decision-making of our federal government to open these things up. But with those tools, what we're able to do is hopefully have a broader influence over the entirety of the Permian Basin. So if we can make some headway in terms of our public lands engagement in New Mexico, that has an opportunity to shift market dynamics, shift the exportation of those resources outside of the area, and really upset the whole balance of the Permian, and hopefully bring about the managed decline of oil and gas extraction in the Permian. And so as we engage, one of the primary tools that we will use is the National Environmental Policy Act. And so because our public lands are federally managed, we have these federal statutes that we can turn to. Now, there's claims that we could bring under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act. There's a lot of different ways to engage, but the sort of backbone or the foundation of how we engage is through NEPA. And NEPA has two aims. One is informed agency decision-making. And so the federal government has an obligation to consider the impacts of their actions on people and the environment. The second aim of NEPA is public participation. It's to inform the public what those impacts are and how they will be impacted, and give the public an opportunity to engage in that decision-making process. So it becomes a really strong tool for us to use as we engage in these processes. When it comes to oil and gas, there's 3 stages that the agency has to go through a NEPA process. All 3 have to be completed before a well can be drilled. The first stage is at the Resource Management Plan, or the RMP. And that planning stage, and Nate, I think, is going to go into this in more detail, right? But in the Carlsbad Field Office, that's 6 million acres. And what the RMP does is it lays out a plan for, this is how this 6 million acres is going to be managed. With respect to oil and gas, that will include making a decision on the lands that are open or closed to oil and gas development. It will include decisions on areas that that the agency would protect for other resource values, like Carlsbad Caverns, like off-road management, like wilderness areas, all of those different types of uses. But it really sets a foundation for subsequent decision-making that will take place around oil and gas. So the RMP is the really critical point for engagement, particularly as it relates to climate impacts. The second stage is the oil and gas leasing stage. So this is where oil and gas companies will submit what are called expressions of interest. And these are where industries say, these are the areas that we want to lease for oil and gas development. And then once those expressions of interests are received, BLM will hold a competitive oil and gas lease sale on a quarterly basis, so about every 3 months. The final decision-making stage is the application for permit to drill, or actually getting a permit to drill an oil and gas well. Sometimes these APDs are submitted by industry just for one well. Sometimes these applications will include multiple wells. And then sometimes they'll come out with what's called sort of a master development plan, which will be, sometimes they'll try to aggregate a bunch of APDs and get sort of baseline approval for those in one document. But those are the 3 main stages. And so we have an opportunity to engage at each of those stages. And a couple of the things that we are looking at are a couple of the foundational claims. One is based on alternatives. So what are the alternatives that you're considering? Not just leasing all the lands or approving all the wells to drill, but what are some alternatives that the agency might consider to analyze sort of a range of different type of impacts from different types of things that they could approve. And then the other is an obligation to take a hard look at impacts. And this is what gives us an opportunity to challenge the agency's analysis when it comes to climate change, impacts to public health, impacts to water quantity and quality, impacts to air quality. And so one of the things that I think we're going to be sending out to all of you that Ali has put together is a way for you all to engage in that decision-making process. So recalling that one of the twin aims of NEPA is public participation and informing the public of actions, it gives us a critical opportunity for the public to engage. The document that Ali will circulate, I think later this week, that I imagine is going to be informed in part by the conversation that we're going to have later in this meeting, will create sort of a template for all of you to be able to submit meaningful comments and engage meaningfully with the agencies, and for a way to sort of go about doing that. And just so you all know, as well as our partners, we're going to be submitting technical legal comments at all of these stages as well. We routinely do that for oil and gas lease sales. We will do that for the RMP process itself. We'll do that sometimes for drilling permits as well, particularly large aggregated ones. But one of the really important things is that we're not living in the area. And so you all know the particularized impacts that you're experiencing from all of this development. You know the area much better than we do. You know the impacts that you are experiencing as individuals. And so there's ways that we can help you engage in that process and help to hold the agency accountable. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Hopefully I think there's time at the end to have a little bit of a broader discussion and answer questions, but let me leave it at that. And I think Nada might be next on the list, but thank you all.
Thank you, Kyle. Great.
Okay, I'll go next.
Okay.
Hopefully this works. I'm Nada. I work for the National Audubon Society, and I just have a few slides just to give you some background on what's going on with the resource management plan. I put this picture up because this is what BLM puts up on their homepage of what they think of when they think of the Carlsbad RMP or resource management plan, which you might think would be a very good indication of what would be in there, but is not quite what's in there. But it does show that they realize there are things happening in the greater Carlsbad area other than oil and gas development. And the resource management plan is really the place we can look at that. So hoping you can all see this slide, which is, this is the Carlsbad planning area and shows all the area that is being looked at when they consider what's happening in the field office in particular. The different colors represent different agencies that manage different types of land. So the yellow is the BLM lands that we were just talking about. And what's at stake here is we're going to be updating decisions that have been in place since 1988. There have been a few little changes to the plan since then, but really we're operating under a document that's more than 30 years old. And resource management plans generally stay in place for decades. And that's why we keep coming back to the existing decisions, because in this field office, there are 2.1 million surface acres, but 2.7 million acres of subsurface, so oil and gas. So those may be under state lands or private lands, for instance, in this area. But the plan will decide which of those are open or closed to leasing. Even if they're open to leasing, how would they be managed? But we'll also consider all the other resources in this plan, such as wildlife, wilderness, recreation, and water. And we'll decide what's available for different uses and whether, sorry about that, different areas might be managed for specific purposes or protection. And BLM has designations they can use to protect certain areas just for wildlife or recreation. And all of us have proposed a lot of those over the years. Right now, this plan has been in process for many years. The last draft that came out and we all commented on only closed, I think, about, under 85,000 acres to oil and gas leasing out of 2.7 million. So if you're struggling quickly with math, it's about 3%. So if you think about the fact that the Bureau of Land Management is supposed to be managing our public lands for a range of uses and as the steward of public lands for all of us and wildlife and recreation and so forth, it's not clear they're doing such a hot job. And in this situation, you know, what we're looking at is what the BLM could be doing. And you'll hear from Emily in a few minutes, but one of the things they're supposed to take into account is the impacts of their decisions. So if they open areas to oil and gas development, how does it protect the Carlsbad Caverns National Park? How does it affect wildlife? How does it affect water? And that's, as Kyle was mentioning, the point of the National Environmental Policy Act to make those decisions, but that's also the BLM's job. So just to give you a sense, this is just a quick look at some key areas for conservation. This is a gradation that the state itself has identified, and the more red and beige you see, the more value there is for conservation, which might inspire you to make better decisions. You can see in this planning area, there's a lot of dark red. But so far, not so good, but we're gonna keep working on that. This is just a quick visual of the amount of leasing in the planning area, and it should make you go, but you already know that, and you're already making that sound for a variety of reasons. This is from the end of 2018 when we last ran these numbers, but you can see, you know, there's an area around the park that's kind of open, not leased yet, but it's a lot of leasing in this planning area. And this is a quick look also, and these are, like I said, older maps from 2018, but you can see the red leases are held by production, and what that means, and maybe you all probably already know a lot of this, but it means that they're in development. In other words, they'll keep going. When the Bureau of Land Management issues a federal lease, it's in effect for 10 years unless you start producing oil and gas. And if you keep producing, you get to keep it for as long as you keep producing. So we started looking at, in the field office, how much of this was held by production and how much might be expiring sometime in the near future. And a number of these leases that are in green or yellow should be going away and giving us more opportunities to make better decisions in the land use plan. If they expire now and the land use plan says they're no longer prioritized for oil and gas development, then we can actually protect these areas. So just quickly where we are with the land use plan. As I mentioned, we've been through scoping and draft, and the resource management plan, or RMP, is now supposed to be coming soon around the bend to final, but we're coming up on a year when it was going to be issued any minute. So I'd like to think that all the controversy might be helping us, and also a little bit of chaos in DC. But whenever this next step happens, the Bureau of Land Management will select what they call the proposed plan. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's going to close 3% or less of lands to oil and gas leasing. But it is an opportunity, in theory, for the BLM to respond to all the comments they've received during this multi-year planning process and to make further changes. And as the public, we really have an opportunity here, to make one more stand. There's a 30-day formal administrative protest period. And while it is fun to carry a sign around and do that kind of protesting, this kind of protesting is actually a written protest. It's a formal administrative protest where we identify what the Bureau of Land Management, once again, has not quite done right. But the other really important thing I wanted to highlight for this group is that our governor in New Mexico has 60 days to do what's called a consistency review. This is unique to the Bureau of Land Management, and it has consistently provided us with some helpful results. In that 60 days, the governor will look at whether or not what the Bureau of Land Management is proposing is consistent with what the state and local plans, policies, and programs are doing. And she will submit that in 60 days and propose changes that the BLM should make to be more consistent. As you know, due to our changing in governorship since this plan started, the current governor has some different ideas about whether or not we should be protecting water and wildlife and maybe being a little more reasonable on ongoing oil and gas development in this area. And it's really a big opportunity for raising key issues. In order to submit an administrative process, you have to have participated in some way in this process along the way. But this group can certainly raise the issues for the governor to weigh in, or for the county to weigh in, or for cities to weigh in, or whomever, either as part of the consistency review or to submit their own administrative protests. So the Energy, Minerals, Natural Resources Department could submit a protest, the county could submit a protest, the town could submit a protest. So those are all things that I really just wanted to flag here, that even if this hasn't been something the group has thought about, getting your ideas and your concerns in when the plan comes out to the governor and the government, local and state, will be really helpful. What we've seen around the country is, even though the Bureau of Land Management has been very much following this administration's approach to oil and gas above all things, they have made concessions in pretty much every plan where there's been pushback by a governor. Is it to the extent we would say is perfect? No, but it is something. And so it's a really important opportunity. And of course, we'll make sure that you all are advised when it comes out, because after that, the Bureau of Land Management will sign and publish a record of decision. And at that point, we're back to all the legal maneuverings that Kyle was mentioning, which I'm sure will come to pass as well. So thanks. I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Emily from the National Parks Conservation Association.
Emily?
Thank you. Yes, thanks. I'm going to see if I can do this correctly. Share screen. All right, is everybody seeing my screen?
Yep, that's good.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to try to get this actually into presenter mode so I can see notes at the same time. By chance, does anybody know how to do that?
You do it if you click on slideshow, Emily.
Uh-huh.
Did I give you those options?
Slideshow. Let's see.
Does the present online give you your notes?
You might also unshare, and then when you unshare starts the slideshow, and then you can choose to share the ongoing slideshow piece, but you yourself can do other things on your computer. I could be very wrong about that, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry about this. Joan and Natalie, I might ask you guys to play it on your end, because I just will want to make sure that I've got notes so I don't forget any important points.
I can do that. I can share it from my screen and do my best to follow along if that works.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, ready when you are, Emily.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. So thank you so much, Natalie, Joan, Kyle, Allie, Nada, everybody else for being here. My name is Emily Wolf. I may have met a few of you in the past. I'm NPCA's New Mexico Program Coordinator. You can go to the next slide. So NPCA is a parks advocacy organization, and I wanted to share the mission of the National Park Service to give some context of energy work in the Permian and some of the work that the role that parks can play in this kind of mitigation of impacts from oil and gas development. So the National Park Service mission states, preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And as we know, many protected sites in and around parks have deep cultural significance and are actively used today by communities connected with them. The sites protect fresh air and clean water, provide opportunities to view wildlife, provide wildlife with corridors, protect historic and cultural resources, offer recreation, iconic views, and quiet and solitude. So as Ali and Neda and Kyle discussed, the leasing of federal lands, mostly Bureau of Land Management land, for private oil and gas development has been occurring for decades. In the last few years, this has ticked up tremendously, with 24.4 million acres offered for lease since January 2017. In the 8 years before that, a total of 30.6 million acres were offered for lease. And that rapid escalation is taking place in about 20 states, but mostly concentrated in Colorado, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, and Alaska. And Ali discussed a typical lease lasts about 10 years. Often leaseholders don't allow their leased lands to be utilized for other uses, including conservation, recreation, grazing. And to further exacerbate the problem, the current administration has removed safeguards from oil and gas planning and leasing processes that further endanger parks and their resources. We'll go to our next slide. A report that NPCA put out found that 33 of America's most visited national parks have as much air pollution as our 20 largest cities across the country, and not one national park in the lower 48 states is free of haze pollution. And our next slide. And that same report found that visitation drops by at least 8% when air at a national park isn't clean. And then the rest of this information, I think you're all very familiar with some of the varieties of constituents produced air pollutants from industrial development and oil and gas drilling. So we can go on to our next slide. And so to focus in on the Carlsbad Caverns National Park, I'll talk a little bit about the impacts that the oil and gas sector have had on the park and the surrounding landscape and air quality. So this is, of course, in the Chihuahuan Desert of southern New Mexico. And it preserves a portion of the Capitan Reef, one of the best preserved exposed Permian age fossil reefs in the world. Water, geologic forces, climatic changes, vast spans of time have produced and changed the fossil reef and its spectacular caves, which continues to be a process today. And the Chihuahuan Desert is shared by 2 nations and is the most biologically diverse desert in the Western Hemisphere, one of the most diverse in the world. And go, actually, a couple of slides. And yeah, perfect. And 2019 National Park Service report had showed that 466,000 visitors to Carlsbad, and sorry, my puppy is biting my feet. Let me try to, sorry everybody. Showed that 466,000 visitors to Carlsbad in 2018 spent $30.2 million in communities near the park. That spending supported 405 jobs in the local area and a cumulative benefit to the local economy of $34 million. So Carlsbad sits at the convergence of the Delaware and Permian basins, a very incredibly active oil and gas field, one of the nation's most active. Oil and gas development can have unanticipated consequences to the air quality, the water quality, the geology of the caverns, which I'll go into a little bit, groundwater. It can have disastrous effects on health and air quality in nearby communities. Into our next slide. And then oil and gas physical infrastructure near parks is also problematic. It can fragment wildlife habitat, pollute waterways, disrupt dark night skies, and parks resources like quiet soundscapes. Carlsbad Caverns has facilities installed for air quality monitoring, including monitoring particulates believed to cause haze, impair Carlsbad Caverns viewshed, and they monitor for volatile organic compounds such as sulfur dioxide and ozone. Less than half the units in the National Park Service have similar equipment, but the caverns are considered a Class 1 airshed, and the air must be monitored to protect the health of the park, its visitors, and the environment. So because there's equipment that is kind of more actively monitoring, in 2018 records showed 10 ozone exceedances. This is maybe all data I think you've probably heard before. 10 ozone exceedances of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That followed 5 years without a single exceedance before the oil and gas. In 2019, records showed 15 exceedances. There were 4 days of exceedance in July 2019 and 2 in August, up to 99 parts per billion each day. Ozone levels are typically higher in the summer as they're formed when sunlight interacts with VOCs. This year, and this is something that I remember talking to you, Natalie and Joan, a little bit about, there's data missing on ozone for the summer months, which is a really big problem and reflects the huge problem of there just not being enough data and equipment in general. So meanwhile, the equipment that monitors particulates and their sources was set up 4 years ago at the caverns and began to point to increased industrial activity throughout the region. Carlsbad Caverns actually used to rely on Guadalupe Mountains National Park, about a half-hour southwest into Texas for such readings, but within the last couple of years, with their more localized equipment, they were showing much higher levels of particulates coming from the southeast from the Pecos Valley oil field. So the park is actually expecting to install a new suite of air quality monitoring equipment to just get a better picture of what pollutants are occurring. I've reached out to the Park Service, the superintendent, to see if that was the process that was delayed throughout the summer, and I will reach out to this group and let you guys know when that installation might be expected and then where that data would be publicly available. All right, so we're on the flaring slide. So this is an image taken from the park itself of the huge impact that drilling has had on the dark sky viewshed. In 2019, January alone, operators in the Permian Basin flared or vented more than 1.9 billion cubic feet of methane. An April report this year noted approximately 700 million cubic feet per day flared in the first quarter of 2020. Along with venting and flaring comes all of these other constituents that are hazardous to human health. And then not all threats are known to Carlsbad Caverns. There's a risk of damage to the subterranean features of the park. A lot of the caves actually extend pretty far and wide beyond the park boundaries. And nitrogen deposition from NOx has been shown to damage the soil in the fragile Chihuahuan desert ecosystem. We go to the next slide. So this map shows, this is actually from a New Mexico wild showing some of the September 2018 parcels and where they conflicted with these areas that the BLM has designated as high cave and karst potential. So this is their own guidance. The red shows where the BLM has assessed that there's a pretty high potential for a lot of openings, a lot of cave and karst and subterranean openings beneath the surface, orange, as we get into the medium and low categories. And so many parcels have conflicted with these BLM designated cave and karst areas and are continued to be drilled. And if you look closely at the very top border, so the park is in purple, and there's a couple of red cross-hatched shapes right to the north boundary of the park. That's an area that is protected under the Lechuguilla Protection Act, and drilling is not allowed in that region, but drilling has taken place or been proposed directly around that region, so in that really critical area. And then groundwater is also a primary issue. Cave and karst landscapes, which characterize the caverns, are fragile and extremely vulnerable to outside impacts. Karst aquifers are recharged by rainwater moving through fractures in the bedrock, sometimes through open conduits and cave passages, and transport water into the groundwater systems. There's very little filtering of the water as it makes it down through the surface, and so as a result, contaminants from oil and gas spills and leaks, which Ali had described, can easily move from the surface or from leaky casing or pipelines down into the aquifer system. So several spots surrounding, in addition to the karst role in creating and maintaining the cavern system, karst also plays a vital role in local water supplies, as much as 98% of the water supply for the city of Carlsbad comes from the Capitan Reef Aquifer. Many ranching communities rely on the groundwater for cattle operations and domestic use. We'll go to our next slide. Thank you. And so there are several state regulations in development which are engaged with in a lot of partners, and we're engaged with ensuring that those rules are very strong as possible to counter all of these impacts, which involve regional haze, methane and ozone, greenhouse gas rules, and other tools, as others have mentioned, involve challenging agencies in comments and analysis and doing action alerts. And so all of these are kind of as the lease sales roll out to challenge them and take all of the actions necessary and possible. So I'll talk a little bit about the regional haze rule, since Carlsbad Caverns is that applies to the caverns being a Class 1 airshed. There are about 9 Class 1 airsheds in New Mexico, I believe, and a mixture of parks and wilderness areas. So the regional haze rule under the Clean Air Act requires states to develop and implement comprehensive plans to reduce human-caused regional haze. For Western states, and I'll talk about this is actually perfect to have this slide up. So the blue outline shows the states that are involved with the Western Regional Air Partnership. And these states have been advised, I guess, suggested to study possible controls to, in particular, NOx, SO2, SO4, and PM10. And the New Mexico regulators kind of have discretion on what they really want operators to address. So this slide also, can we go back for just a second on that last one? Thank you. The list of websites here show a couple of the different locations for some of the information that the state is putting out there. So they have received some analyses from operators, which, and I'll go into that a little bit more. Operators are submitting these analyses to the state to basically say, this is what it would cost for us to install X, Y, or Z control. And so the state then responds, and that's the point where we get involved and make sure that the companies are reporting the correct numbers and assessing the costs in the best way. And in the Western Regional Air Partnership, they do a lot of modeling based on estimated reductions of emissions if various regional haze scenarios are put in place. All right, so you can go to our next slide. So the source selection has taken place, and it's how NMED decides which sources to request analysis of pollution controls from. So that's the Q over D analysis. And I will send these slides out to everybody, since there's just kind of like lists of ways that that's determined. It might be interesting, and also just to have the websites. And so they're looking at the quantity of SO2 and NOx divided by the distance to the nearest Class 1 area of any given facility. And so they kind of look at these more major emitters for this round. So each round of regional haze further reduces emissions and captures more and more of these facilities and sources. So we're in round 2 right now. So in the next round, there would be more and more operators. But the idea is to make sure that enough are captured and controls imposed on them that it really starts to have a marked decrease in emissions in a given area. So we'll go on to our next slide. So these are the sources that the state has identified. We and our partners, Sierra Club, Western Environmental Law Center, Dene Care, San Juan Citizens Alliance group have performed the Q over D analysis actually on all of the Title V sources in the state, and have shared that analysis with the state and public to better gauge kind of some of these emissions estimates and push the state to impose strong controls. But these are the ones that they've requested 4-factor analyses from. All right, so our next slide will show what the 4-factor analysis is. So that is what the company is assessing: the cost of compliance for a given control, time necessary for compliance, energy, non-air environmental impacts, and the remaining useful life of the source. And so they calculate the cost effectiveness of each control, and then kind of give the state that information of, here's how much it would cost us to reduce this amount of emissions per year. So we're working with our partners to provide technical information and analysis to the state. We look at the oil and gas and electric generating unit four-factor analyses to kind of assess them for accuracy and advocate to the Environment Department for the strongest possible pollution control equipment to be installed, as well as proposing rules, providing economic and technical analysis to advocate for options like electrification, which would fully eliminate emissions, and working with the state to surmount some of the regulatory barriers to electrification. And then there are some other ways that the laws and rules which protect parks can be put to work to safeguard air quality. For example, Section 126 of the Clean Air Act and other tools that are like specific to parks, specific to public lands. So kind of an example of how these four-factor analyses are, companies have not done the best job at creating their four-factor analyses. They've greatly overestimated the cost of installing controls in a lot of cases. So we've provided critiques to New Mexico Environment Department to address those inflated costs and correct erroneous assumptions that companies make and advise where they should ask for more information. So this is all just to ensure that they're being held accountable, that the tools that these air quality rulemakings offer are being put to best possible use. And so finally, we're also involved in helping interested stakeholders and communities to become involved throughout the public engagement process with the state, with any and all public hearings or events, as well as providing tools so that interested community advocates actively working on these issues, as you all are, can participate in these processes and contribute letters and just become involved. So the next slide has just a couple of opportunities, not too many specific dates. The Hays rule, there's going to be an outreach webinar that the state will hold. They haven't announced the date of that yet, but that would be an opportunity to ask questions and see where they're, how they're coming along and what they're going to require that operators do to control their pollution and to make sure that they're doing a robust enough job of that. And so early next year, the state implementation plan for Hays will be released in draft form. It's due to EPA in July next year. And the ozone precursor rule, which I think many of you were probably involved in, I just wanted to, I saw today that that comment period on the draft rule is extended to September 16th. And then the next slide has a website that has where a lot of these events and opportunities will just be consistently updated if you're interested in seeing more. And then my email is on the last slide, and I will pass this slideshow on to everybody because the last several slides had a lot of text on them. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Emily.
Thank you. Yes. So do we have questions for our presenters?
Will all of this be available for us after this? This is all recorded. We can get all of this afterwards, right?
Absolutely, Penny. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
A question about these leases. Now, you said they're about for 10 years. What is the condition for continuing to be able to keep those? And what kind of payments are made? Is that all going to the federal government if it's BLM? Do they pay that yearly? How does that lease process work?
So yes, once the base term of a lease is 10 years and you get to keep it as long as you pay your rent for that first 10 years. And there's annual rent, and you also pay royalties on production. It's 12.5% of your royalties are paid to the feds, and they split it approximately half. It's a little less than half, but about half with the states. So about half of it goes into the coffers of the state of New Mexico, and it primarily goes for education funding. And the requirement for your lease to continue is that you're producing in what they call payable quantities, which just basically means it's economically viable to keep actually producing on the lease. So most leases do stay in effect for that 10 years because, you know, a base rent can be, you know, $1.50, $2 an acre. So it can be fairly economical to keep your lease to decide if you ever want to develop it. And the Bureau of Land Management also has a history of letting operators extend their lease beyond the 10 years. So they have a process where you can just ask them to put it on ice for you. They call it suspension. Also, even if your lease gets terminated for not paying your rent, you can basically just pay it later and get it reinstated. So that's why they normally last the 10 years. It's a pretty low threshold.
Yeah, I think that those facts related to leasing and production and so forth are important for us to understand, especially now as the election season heats up. What we're seeing in the 2nd District down here is the two candidates from opposite parties, both trying to sort of position themselves so that they look favorable in the eyes of the industry, because there is such a big economic investment at stake here for the state of New Mexico. And so it's interesting that both candidates have been running ads that really emphasize that they are going to try to protect the oil industry in this period. And, you know, you just have to recognize that's what we're dealing with. Other questions from, yeah.
Currently, what environmental impacts do they look at before granting a lease?
Well,
do you want to take that
go ahead,
one?
Kyle.
So there's a whole range of impacts that they would look at. And quite frankly, any impact that you can think of that BLM hasn't thought of themselves creates an obligation for them to consider that impact as well. But typically they'll consider things like impacts to water resources, both quantity and quality issues. They'll consider air quality impacts. They consider climate change impacts. They do consider impacts to public health, or they should. They consider impacts to land use values. So things like wilderness areas, the Carlsbad Caverns that Emily was talking about, national park values. All of these things are sort of within the realm of their hard look obligation. Now, whether they do a good job of considering those impacts is a different question. And that's oftentimes what we end up suing the BLM about, is their failure to do a sufficient job of considering that range of impacts.
You know, following up with Penny's question, have they looked at emotional impacts, psychological impacts, spiritual impacts? Are those things that have been brought up?
Typically, I haven't. I don't know. You know, I don't know if Nada or anyone else has any other experiences. I haven't seen those types of things brought up in NEPA documents. That being said, you know, there are sort of broad sort of social and human impacts. You know, health impacts are something that, again, I think BLM does a really poor job of quantifying and calculating what those health impacts are. I have not seen them get into the sort of mental health impacts or the psychological or spiritual impacts. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be considering those things. And so if in comments, for example, we can make a good case that those are things that they should be considering, then it's the agency's obligation then to either sufficiently consider those impacts or explain to the public why those impacts shouldn't be considered. But we have an opportunity to present that information or that evidence and then put it on BLM to either do that analysis or explain why they're not going to, or why they don't have to. But it does then give us an opportunity to challenge those choices that the agency makes.
And yeah, I think there could be a lot of ways to make that case in terms of, you know, how you classify those impacts and how you make that case in comments or that sort of thing. But the one thing I have seen, I've never seen BLM really do a dedicated look at those sorts of things. And even to the extent that I've seen people raise things like that in comments, unfortunately, BLM tends to ignore them. But the one thing that I have seen them do a little bit in a couple of lease sale EAs is just very briefly raised. Sometimes it'll be like under their sad excuse for an environmental justice analysis. And they'll briefly say something like, oh, you know, there could be some psychological effects from noise pollution or things like that. Some very sort of general, narrow thing like that. And then when they have raised it at all, they tend to dismiss it immediately afterwards. And they do this with air quality impacts and other things too, but they tend to say, oh, but that will just, especially with noise or things like that. Basically all of these will be temporary because once, you know, construction is over and things like that, all of these more sort of psychological impacts will go away. And it's all really just a temporary nuisance. And that's something I've been seeing them do more and more, is sort of dismiss a lot of these things as temporary nuisance. And so that's something to really push back on. And I think in particular in the context that Joan mentioned, you know, those are not, you know, even if what's causing the impacts might arguably be temporary, the impacts themselves can last for a really long time, and BLM has to look at that too.
Probably one of the important things that we focused on today, I would think is probably the most important talking point for us, is the economic impact that the state park and the national parks bring to this area. This is a really substantial part of the economy in Eddy County, and especially in Carlsbad. And it's been interesting in the past few years with the advent of, you know, the uptick in emission or in drilling and all of that, that the impact of so many workers coming here has raised the rents and has raised motel accommodations and that kind of thing, to the point where it really has an adverse impact on the whole tourist industry. So I think those figures are really important about how much that contributes to our economy as we think about the strong points to emphasize when we think about, you know, try to counter the oil industry's whining.
Yeah, I think the Bureau of Land Management has a history of talking a lot about the economic benefits of oil and gas development, but not looking at the economic costs associated with it. And some of those are the ones you're speaking of, which are impacts to the tourism industry and other parts of the way the community functions. And then also, you know, we have made arguments, and I think we'll continue to, that there are these less monetary, but you can monetize the economic impacts to quality of life, to clean water, clean air, recreation, that those actually do have a cost in addition to the climate impacts. And those are all things that can be monetized, and they need to take that into account when they're saying, this is the best thing for your community. You're going to make some money. Yeah. I think it's a great point.
But I think the one thing to underline here is that those natural resources are always going to be here. Oil and gas are not going to be here. Maybe in 10 years, we don't know, maybe 5 years. Maybe they're leaving tomorrow, we don't know. But so it's important to focus on those resources that are critical, really, to the economy of the area as we deal with these energy companies.
I think, Jean, it's important that we we have to stress that we have to protect those natural resources that you're talking about, because if the oil and gas comes in with these things like the caves that are fragile, these cave and karst systems that are fragile, that can be damaged by the oil and gas coming in and their emissions, and if they're drilling and they lease too close and they drill, and they come and they drill, and then when they're done, like you said, even when they drill, if it's a temporary nuisance, yes, it's temporary, but then they drill and they get their oil and gas, and then they leave, but they've done damage to these caves and the karst systems. That's permanent damage that does not repair itself. And then this tourism system is now ruined, and this system is now ruined, and now our income system that is for the city is now ruined. And there you have problems coming in our city. And now it's not a temporary problem, it's a permanent problem that has occurred because of their drilling.
Comments?
I would like to ask, what are some of the specific things that we down here in the Southeast could be working on? And what would be some of the most effective ways to do that kind of advocacy? Which acts or all of these, the BLM and all this other stuff, where would be a good place to start on that?
Well, I think, obviously, it's what I flagged, but I think starting to weigh in with the state on what they should push back for on the Carlsbad plan would be something they would probably be receptive to, and would allow some broader messaging in addition to engaging with the specific quarterly lease sales that Kyle and Ali discussed. That opportunity does come around every 3 months. Good news. You know, that's something. Management of those lands is something that hasn't been decided. It's something that the governor expects to push back on, but hasn't, I don't think, heard from you all directly yet on what the community really wants. They've heard from those of us who, you know, have had the luxury of following along for many years as this process has unfolded, and made some proposals on everything like just stop leasing altogether, enough already in Carlsbad, because there's so much, as you saw from the map, or how about protecting this area for migratory birds? That would be an Audubon thing, but really an everyone thing. All of those proposals, you know, are still in the mix in many ways. And you know, I don't know if Kyle and Ali and
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Nada said, and then yeah, so for engaging in comments on the lease sales, Kyle sort of went through this a little bit, but if you do want the option of, say, so there's a couple things with engaging on comments. You can engage on comments just to voice your concerns with BLM, put before them things that they should consider. You can also kind of look at it as building a record, so that, say, down the road, you want to be a part of a group that's challenging those lease sales, and suing to try to get those lease sales ideally vacated, or sometimes often it gets kicked back to the agency to have to do a better environmental review. But if you wanted to get those leases vacated so that they couldn't be developed, that sort of thing, you can kind of build a record in these comments of everything that you might want to. So you don't have to have your arguments all planned out, but you can also think of these comments as a way to sort of build a record. So down the road, if you do want to challenge these things, you have that in the record, because you have to sort of exhaust both on this exhaust is the term that in order on your sort of administrative remedies. So you have to engage with BLM in commenting if you do want to be able to challenge it in litigation later. And then you have to raise, at least sort of generally raise the issues that you want to talk about. If you do end up suing to challenge these leases, you have to raise those issues in your comments. So if you wanted to say, hey, you didn't look at health impacts and you should have, you didn't look at impacts to the caverns and you should have, and you didn't say that in your comments, then you're gonna have a much harder time raising it later on. And so that there's sort of a dual function there, I think, with the comments. One really unfortunate aspect of the comments as they are right now is there's only 10 days for comment and protest periods when BLM posts like an environmental assessment, looking at all the impacts or not looking at all the impacts, as the case may be. There's 10 days from when they post that on this site called e-planning, and WELC is going to send around a sort of quick guide to some of this in more detail, a guide to e-planning and things like that, following up from this. But basically you only have 10 days from when they post either the sort of final document for the lease sale for you to protest it, or the in-between stage of sort of draft environmental assessment that you can comment on. You have 10 days from when they post that on e-planning to submit your comments. And that's a really short amount of time. In fact, some courts have held that it is an unlawfully short amount of time. And so, part of our comments too are usually saying in the comments, this is a ridiculously short comment period, and sort of engaging around the problems with barriers to public participation in terms of short comment periods and other things along those lines. But all that to say, I think one thing long-term, if you are thinking about wanting to engage more on lease sales with these 10-day periods, ultimately, I think it could be helpful to have a sort of running template or list of things that you can kind of plug in for each lease sale. And eventually, as you sort of build that, it'll get a little easier, but still really tough to deal with that 10-day turnaround. We now have sort of a form, and it looks like Becca Sobel sent some protest comments in the chat as an example of the sort of highly technical ones, but we have a sort of basic template now that we can use, so it's a little easier to get things turned around in 10 days. It's still really hard, but that's one thing that I would say is if you're thinking about wanting to engage in these longer term, and we're happy to talk more about that with folks and follow up and work with folks on that too. But if to whatever extent that would be helpful, but sort of starting to build so that eventually you have something kind of ready to go with minor adjustments that you can submit.
I guess what I'm suggesting too, and maybe it overlaps, Allie, is, because we don't know when this plan is coming, there's an opportunity now to kind of highlight the issues that you all think are most important and expect the state or Carlsbad itself to weigh in on. And that might also help kind of prioritize some asks to follow up on in a lease sale if you want to wade into the quarterly madness, which would be a really new thing and get the BLM's attention as well. So, not trying to put a lot of work on the group and just thinking about how, maybe how we could be helpful if you do have some bigger ideas that, could be communicated to the state and to the county about the importance of protecting the community and the economy and the caverns and all of that. That's not really time bound yet, but getting out ahead of it would be helpful and probably would inform when and how you'd want to engage in some of the lease sales too.
So just to add quickly, I think I would concur with everything that was said. There's some creative, I think, workarounds potentially that we could make this a little bit of an easier process for folks to engage. If individuals are wanting to engage in the agency decision-making process. As Allie said, engaging on the agency's timeline is burdensome, particularly for individuals who have families and jobs and other things that they're up to. One of the things that we can do that would make it easier is, and I think this is the form that Allie's going to send out later this week, but we can create essentially a template for an individual declaration. where each of you would have an opportunity to list all the ways that you're impacted, all the concerns that you have, and raise those things. And then you can sort of sign that off as a declaration. We can then use those declarations and package them in our own comments. And that will both get them into the record and require the agency to engage. But as Nada said before, for the RMP process, for example, individuals, unless you've already participated, they're not going to accept your protest. But we have raised concerns, for example, in earlier comments that we've submitted about impacts to public health, impacts to the community. And so in that context, we've already exhausted or raised those issues. And so our protests can basically just get those individualized declarations into the record and before the agency, which is sort of a workaround, and it makes it a little bit less onerous on you as individuals to be tracking that process on an ongoing basis. The only other thing I would add to that is that, that's how we engage the agency. Nada brought up a really good point of how we engage our elected officials, our towns, folks at the state. And that is an ongoing sort of process that I think is ripe for our ongoing participation. It's not on the agency's timeline, but it's about sort of changing the thinking, quite frankly, of our elected officials and of our towns. And Jean, for example, brings up really good points about the economic impacts and the sort of short-term benefits of oil and gas versus the long-term impacts to a tourism economy or to local impacts to the community. The other thing that, our elected officials often don't think about is, they see the front-end revenue benefits of oil and gas, but they're not thinking about the long-term cleanup obligations and what happens when these companies declare bankruptcy and the taxpayers are then on the hook for that cleanup. And so through ongoing organizing and engagement, I think there is also a really important role that we can all play in holding our elected officials accountable and starting to get folks to think about not just, the sort of front-end economic benefits, but, the long-term economic transition that is really critical, particularly for a state like New Mexico.
I just wanted to flag that that Rebecca with Wild Earth Guardians had shared one of the recent protests from Wild Earth Guardians and Western Environmental Law Center and the Center for Biological Diversity. And I just wondered if there's, I think this idea of kind of getting ahead of it, as Nada is suggesting, is a great suggestion, because that would give CCFF members more chance to think about it and what would be the key points and key concerns that the group might take to the governor, for example. So I guess I have two questions. One, I'd love to hear from Wild Earth Guardians on kind of what has been successful and how that might translate into something that CCFF does going forward. But then also just to get a sense from some of you experts and resource folks, if, like, I know that the resource management plan isn't released yet, but do we have a good enough sense of what it will look like that we could kind of begin a process with some support from all of you to know where those concerns might lie? So I guess it was a twofold. Maybe we can start with Rebecca, but I'd love to hear from others as well. And I really appreciate this feels like the start of many longer conversations, but I'm really glad we've had a chance to bring all of you together, and we will be sure to share all these materials with the broader membership. A lot of folks are getting involved in elections and things, so we're missing some folks on this call, and we'll be sure to hand off materials that so many of you brought. So just wanted to thank you while I had the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Thanks, friends. I'm having a little bit of audio issues, so hopefully you can still hear me through my phone. Yes, great. Yes, everybody has said some amazing information. What I would just add, my big picture, the Bureau of Land Management process is cumbersome. It's obviously very technical. It exists to alienate the public in some way, shape, or form, and all of us that have spoken are paid to do this work and engage. So if it's overwhelming as a process, that's understandable. And I'd offer in this Trump administration, which has been declared the energy dominance administration, all of those comment periods have gotten shorter. The periods and access for public engagement are less. And so
We lost your audio, Rebecca.
I think the host keeps muting my audio, it says. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. So what I'd add that's worked really well generally is these lease sales that happen 4 times a year, that they don't have to happen 4 times a year, but under this administration, they say they have to happen 4 times a year. They used to be in person, and when they were in person, we would show up at BLM's doorstep and really bring the issues of concern to them, and that was really impactful. They have moved these auctions online, and so what I'd say, big picture, is like the agencies and our political officials, they hear from us all the time, our environmental advocates, and they hear the stories from industry about how oil and gas is bringing so much money in, but they don't hear from the people that are living right next to oil and gas. And so the most impactful stories that we as paid advocates even share are your stories. When you tell us how horrible it is to live next to oil and gas, when there's a pipeline explosion over your house, these are the things that tell a different narrative that's been told. And so what I'd say is where there's collaboration is all the wonky pieces of the lease sale deadlines and the land planning deadlines. We can tell you when those dates are, but the real opportunity for where we can move the needle is when y'all tell your stories the way you do at those key time points. So when we have these quarterly lease sales, they're another opportunity to tell the story again about what it is living with oil and gas and how there's still a spill happening in the Black River at this moment, and at the same time our political officials are neglecting all of the things. And it can be exhausting and cumbersome, and so like this is sort of the lessons learned that I'd share from some of our friends up in the Northwest is having, you all have your group, spreading that burden to share those stories as these opportunities come up can be helpful, because it's telling the same story 30, 40, 50, 60 times until somebody really listens, unfortunately. But what we could also help with is, even in a COVID time, when there are these flashpoints, these artificial deadlines for public comment, we can make them into public and media opportunities. So that Carlsbad field office is in downtown Carlsbad on the river, and even if BLM isn't opening its doors, we can still bring signs and bring people there because Adrian Hennett at the Carlsbad Argus will cover our stories. And I think it's that building momentum so that when we have the session in February, everybody already knows about Citizens Caring for the Future, and they want to know what the community group in Carlsbad has to say about land planning. So y'all.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. So, Joan, is this enough for today?
It is.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the CCF folks will meet, and, there'll be a recording of this on the CCFF website, and folks down there can figure out what you'd like to do. But so we're really grateful to all the speakers. But before we go, this is a special day for Gene, who's been moderating. It's his birthday today. So I think we just need to sing maybe happy birthday. It's hard to do that online. So maybe a couple of us could sing and everybody else could sing on mute.
I think we can leave it to Joan and Marlene to sing.
No, let's have the CCF folks sing. Lucinda and Nick is there too. And
Yeah.
and G. And so why don't, 1, 2, 3, everybody sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jean. Happy birthday to you. And many more.
Well, I'm happy to report that I don't have to celebrate my 84th birthday again.
Thank you for choosing you. So thanks so much, Jean. Happy birthday.
Yes. Well, thank you to our speakers today, and we've learned a lot. We know that we have a tremendous amount of work to do. There's a limited amount of energy and people we've got to do it, but we'll try to do better and do the best we can. So thank you all for today.
Blessings.
God bless you.
Yeah.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, everybody, so much. It's good to see you all. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Blessings.